my guest today, who is Bennett. Bennett, the Canadian Libertarian. I love that first name, to tell you the truth, buddy. That's such a cool name. I wish I had a cool name like that. He is the Canadian Libertarian. He speaks on all types of subjects, just like me. Not just Canadian politics. He also discusses world issues and political shenanigans taking place in the United States and all types of subjects. And Bennett, welcome to Prosscast. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great, Victor, and thanks a lot. And as far as my name goes, it's kind of funny you mentioned that, actually, because having the name Bennett Hunter, you can't imagine how many times I've heard someone say, well, which is your first and which is your last name, right? Because in reality, you could use Bennett as a last name. Actually, most of the time it is a last name, and you can use Hunter as a first name. So yeah, I guess just, call that luck as far as the family chose a couple decent names. And well, I guess my last name was already there, but yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, Victor, because you've been someone that, like I say, I pay attention to your stuff and your Prosscast and your posts, and you're one of those fellow Canadians that, you know, you're not dogmatic per se. I see a lot of that stuff nowadays, and I recognize that the people that I pay attention to the most are the ones that still have a critical mind, that still, you know, wants to listen and be open to ideas, and not, like I say, be so dogmatic in their approach to things. Because well, I mean, as we all know, that's usually the end result is failure if you just, you know, close your mind off to listen to what other people have to say.
Well, that raises a good point, and I'm curious to know this about you, since you're speaking of not being dogmatic and availing yourself to new arguments or evidences or empirical evidence of something that's taken you by surprise, that causes you to pause and rethink some issue. I don't think that I've had to question any of my fundamentals principles too much, but let me ask you, would you describe yourself as an anarchist or voluntarist? And I know you're a libertarian, but that can go either way, of course, minarchist or anarchist or voluntarist, if you want the softer word for it. How did you come to this position? I'm sure you weren't, you didn't come out of diapers with this mindset, philosophy.
Yeah.
How did that come to be?
Actually, I'm curious. Well, you know what? That's actually, I'll try to shrink the story up, but actually I was raised in a very religious family, to be honest with you. But I was the kind of person, I guess I would say it's mostly because of my dad. Actually, he was one of those kind of people that he just didn't seem to conform. I guess he kind of was a bit of a rebel, I guess people would say. Now, that can be used as a negative connotation for some people, but it just, to me, as I grew up, I realized it was just someone that was willing to question things. And I met the wife that I've been with now for 28 years, and she was an atheist, and I come from a very religious family. But my whole thing is, well, just because of the type of person I am, I guess my personality traits, my dad, the other external influence in my life, is I was a live, let live kind of a person. And as long as someone's not trying to impose their wills, their edicts, or their preference on me, is, hey, do your thing. Like I say, and with me and my wife, when raising our kids, I never tried to shove religious dogma down their throat, because I recognized a lot of discrepancies and hypocrisies and contradictions within. And atheism, just, well, as most people realize, it's okay, you're saying you don't believe in God, but what do you believe? Right? So I don't know, like I say, I think the culmination, and then of course, well, fast forward to the Ron Paul movement, which a lot of us, we were all privy thanks to him and seeing him on the world stage when he was, trying to run as a Republican in the presidential race. That was what got me to understand, well, what is this libertarian? Because he just kept speaking things that sounded so truthful, so reasonable, so logical. It's like, well, what the hell is this libertarianism? I started down that road, and we all know, you start out as, okay, libertarian as a politics, as a political position, but then you realize that, okay, let's take these fundamentals. What's libertarianism mean? Well, it's a bunch of principles. It's a bunch of premises. And if you follow those principles or those premises to their logical conclusion, well, and you know this, how the hell do you make room for a state, right? Or some central planning government that's built on mysticism and impossibilities? Well, I'm all about, like I say, it's not just the live, let live mentality, but truth is the other thing that I've recognized as most fundamentally important when you're talking about things as important as, you know, what, well, like I say, fuck the politics. Let's just be honest here. It's about philosophy. Libertarians, in the political sense, they're trying to take an ideal and trying to make that fit into politics. And I don't know how you can do that. I just don't know how that's humanly possible, because you're still kind of lying to people in some degree. And my whole thing is, well, if you want to have a position or a stance and you want people to respect you, then the very first base you should start from is telling the truth. That'll perfectly correlate into maybe later on in the video, as far as what I've heard a lot of stuff when Jordan Peterson's talking, is it's all about telling the truth. And I don't want to keep lying to people. You can use political language, right? Minarchist arguments, but you're still lying to a person. And I just don't like, when my kids were old enough, and I was young enough to think that it was smart to tell your kids about Santa Claus, and then when they get older, but you don't tell your kids a middle ground, like, well, there is a real Santa, but you got to stop believing them. No, you tell your fucking kids that Santa doesn't exist, right? And I don't want to tell people that, oh yes, we still should leave some space for fallible human beings who have authority over others, because, well, we've seen the culmination of, especially in the 20th century, for most people that understand recent examples of that kind of forced collectivism mentality, is we've seen how devastating and destructive it can be.
Yeah, you know, and it's funny that you mention the popular phrase, I think, is statism is a religion. And I think that a lot of people who say that don't necessarily know just how linked mysticism or a belief in the supernatural is, so far as being a conduit or a sustainer and creator of what became government. This whole idea that there is a special elite that's to rule over all of society and to guide it and to steer the ship of state and so forth, and to create civilization from what the philosopher Thomas Hobbes would describe as a state of nature pre-government. And so how do you see, curious to ask, you know, religions, or mysticism for that matter, mysticism's role in being creators or sustainers of world governance for all the millennia, for all time?
Well, you know what? I'm glad that's. Yeah, sorry for cutting you off there.
Go ahead.
So actually, that's a perfect segue into this whole thing, and I'm so thankful. I'm so grateful, because probably like yourself and a lot of us, is once you start down that rabbit hole, as people like to suggest or use that terminology, is, you know, how do we get to having some kind of sense of morality, logic? And I mean, as we understand, religion was used in the past, but when you break it down to individuals, you know, as groups promoting a particular ideal, well then, especially when you talk about humans, all humans are fallible, and we all recognize and realize that. But because of people like, well, like I say, you got Ayn Rand with her objectivism, the philosophy of objectivism, which I totally respect that woman. My God, she did an amazing job at trying to, you know, take it out of the mystical realm and almost like a scientific endeavor. And then you got people like Stefan Molyneux, who kind of took that, all the philosophical endeavors from like Aristotle onward to Ayn Rand, and then tried to maybe tweak some of the areas that maybe she hadn't quite perfected. And you know what? I expect maybe someday we may get to the point where you can make it so scientific in nature that we won't need to rely on the mystical realm anymore, or this construct that humans have created to give us a sense of morality or ethics. Because as we all understand, if you just use pure scientific or objective evidence, well, you can fall on either side of that, and you can use you can use that for good and evil. What I understand now, especially with people like Jordan Peterson coming into the equation, which is like, it's almost like, how did this all come? It's like it all fell into place for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people is, okay, we were all confused. What's up with this? I don't want to be a mystic. I don't want to believe in this crazy out of this world nonsense that I know that, but it's based on the denominations. What I understand intrinsically now is the thing that has faltered tremendously when you're using religious dogma is the fact that it's all based on now subjective preferences of denominations, of many different variances of a religion. But when you think about it, morality is a human construct. There's no way to get around it because we all know that there's ways that you can get around. If you use scientific or objective reason only, then you can make excuses for immoral acts and habits and behaviors, which is why, just like when you play a game, what I consider God now, and I try to break it down to the simplistic terms because I understand a lot of people that listen to the kind of stuff that we promote is these are layman people. They need to understand in real world language what it means is what I like to liken to is if you were playing a game, I don't care if it's Monopoly or whatever board game you're playing. Well, that's probably not the greatest, but if you're playing any game or in any sport, the most important thing for everyone to participate is there has to be a boundary of like set rules. Without this a specific set of rules, well, that everyone can just make up the rules as they go along, right? So if you lose out this day, well, you can just tweak the rules to make it so that you're the winner the next day. Well, that doesn't work because then it's just, well, once again, that's just that race to just going back to nature where it's just about whoever's the most powerful. And if you go back to that, then we're just part of the animal kingdom. And then once again, you've lost any sense of morality and what separates humans from the animal kingdom. So what God represents to me now, but it took me all this time to come to learn these things, is what God truly represents to me now, even though I understand it as someone that understands the objectivist and the atheist mentality, is morality has to come from somewhere. Ethics, because like I said, it's a human construct. And if it's got to come from somewhere, you either got to place it in the hands of human beings, which as we all know, we're all fallible, or in an ideal. Now, if you want to call that ideal God, to me, call it God, whatever you want to call it. I, as a person that still remains, entrenched in science and objective reason and logic, that God that I was taught when I was going to church, right, as a young man, that's a totally different, that's, like I say, that was people that was trying to use that kind of dogma for their own personal reasons. But the ideal, I think, is the thing that we have to keep as the fundamental. If we're going to be human beings and accept that we have to live and cohabitate and coexist with each other, there has to be an ideal way of doing it. The minute you take the power out of the hands of human beings and put it in the place of an ideal, like gravity. Gravity is another, I mean, it's real, but what we call it is something that we conjured up, but it's as real as it can get. But because it's outside the realm of, we can't manipulate gravity per se, gravity is going to exist. It kind of is in some way, in some regard, in that mystical realm, because you can't say, oh, look, here's gravity. No, but you can show the results of gravity, and the results of gravity are clear every time. And the results of morality are clear every time. That's the only way humans can exist in a societal modern setting.
Right. When you say that the gravity, though, really is just a relationship of empirical data, such as the Earth in relation to other objects, and gravity per se is not a construct, but it's just simply a form of inanimate matter interacting with one another, as you have with physics. If you pick up a fork and you extend your hand and you open your hand and drop it, necessarily has to fall to the ground. We don't see gravity stapled on that per se, but we can know that it pertains to actual existence and existing objects, that is. So in that sense, it can be empirically validated, whereas the supernatural is completely impenetrable to the senses whatsoever. In fact, we are told by religious authorities that it's something that has to be accepted on faith, and faith is being not just the absence of evidence, but contrary to evidence. I mean, does that make sense? And that also, and that also brings us to the realm of ethics, because ethics is it's a matter of intangibilities and relationships and principles and abstractions and whatnot. A lot of people tend to think, well, because it's in that abstract realm, it's not something that I can put my hands on and smell and touch. So that there, in that sense, it's mystical. Do I understand your thinking on that to follow along those lines?
Yeah, you're pretty close to it. And like I say, this is the problem. And I've heard the back and forth. Actually, that's the thing I want to point out too. Without having all these opinions, put forth and presented to me, I would to this day, I would not be have the capacity to be even remotely objective in my mind, or be clearer or concise in my thinking. It's the fact that we have this, and that's why I say you can't have a fully one-size-fits-all approach, because there's always going to be variables like you suggest. And I hope that maybe someday humanity, maybe a couple hundred years off into the future, we can completely reject any pretense of any of this dogma or religious aspects. But like I said, what it comes down to me ultimately is, because like I've heard Sam Harris's arguments, I've heard arguments from a multitude of people very much wiser and smarter than I am. But what it comes down to me is either humans set the rules, but because they're fallible, you can't really place your faith in a human being per se, because you just don't know what their underlying intentions are. Whereas an ideal, which ultimately to me, if humans can get to the point, and that's kind of, I guess, what these kinds of conversations and these kinds of talks are all about, is trying to help even some of the religious dogmatists, like people in my family, so that you understand it's not about this just blind faith in a God, because that's just as bad as blind faith in a human being, that they can manipulate you in many ways. It's not about a collective mindset. It's about placing the emphasis on an ideal. Which is why when you come down to it, the other thing they all have in common. Here's the thing I want you to think about real quick. Whether it's the Christian religion, objectivism, or Stefan Molyneux's universal preference behavior, they all share one common factor it's inescapable, and it's got to be about the universal idea of the individual. Without the individual, the minute you take rights, responsibilities, or ethics or morality away from the individual and you put it in a group, well, then it's that gang mentality. It's collectivism. Collectivism 101 is really what it is. So God, there isn't the modern iteration, especially with Jesus, which is where they try to tweak the narrative of the Bible, is to make it about Jesus, right? The ideal, the ideal person that came down to the earth and showed us that this is what it is to live as an ideal human being. But once again, if you read the actual stories, then you can point out many points where that doesn't necessarily align and can be used against us as well. So it's not about the religion of Christianity per se. What it really comes down to is the ideal, which has to be broken down to, if you care about rights or responsibilities or morality, ultimately the smallest minority, just like Ayn Rand said, is the individual. So it has to be about the individual. If the minute you take the rights and responsibilities away from the individual, then it's just collective groupthink, and then it's just team A against team B. So I hope that there's people a lot wiser and smarter than I am that will come to figure this out and make it so that it's a scientific undertaking or endeavor at some point where we'll all understand it as simple as gravity, like you say, because gravity is easily reproducible. You can do it here, you can do it halfway around the world, you can do it any place you want, and gravity will continually show that it works and it functions as it's originally intended to be. But in a way, and that's kind of what objectivism and UPB is, it almost works that way for humans too. Like if I treat people good and that whole thing and that reciprocal effect, that is the best based platform. The problem, though, that I recognize and realize is that too can be misconstrued because, well, just like the example of morality, if you want to use the subjective example of if there's 6 people and there's 5 people, there's 2 tracks, 2 railroad tracks, right? And they diverge. And you're the person that has the ability to switch whether the train goes this way or this way. Well, if there's 1 person versus 5 people, well, from a purely abstract or scientific methodology, well, you would want to save the 5 people as opposed to that 1 person, right? Because you're saving 5 lives instead of 1. So mathematically, without using morality or ethics in that equation, it's like, well, of course you want to save the 5. But what if that 1 person is your son, your daughter, your wife, your mother, your father? That changes the equation and the dynamic completely. And it's not even, here's another thing, I'll go even further step than that, is it wouldn't even matter. That would already tell you that people should automatically change the equation from the 5 to the 1. And you think, well, that makes sense, right? Because you would want to save someone that's in your family. But what about if that person was a family member that, sexually molested you as a child? Well, then that changes the equation again. So it is something that I expect that's going to be hammered out and discussed by principled people such as yourself, myself, and many others out there. This is a discussion that has to take place because we've got to come to a realization of what's the best practice, or maybe there should be multiple competing practices. This is where my capitalist side of me kind of kicks in. It's like, well, wait a minute. How do you get to determine what's going to be best if you don't have competing factions vying for what's going to be adopted properly? What seems morally or ethically consistent? So to me, that's, once again, it ties right into the libertarianism, the live, let live mentality. Is I just don't want people to be able to force or impose their preferences, their ideas, their edicts on others. Yeah, let's hammer out these ideas, which is kind of what pisses me off. And I'll tie this up real quick. I know I ramble on, but with the political landscape, the media landscape, and those in academia, nobody's having these fucking conversations, except for people like ourselves or people that don't have that dogma, right? That have already shaken a lot of that stuff off in their past, in their lives. You're not hearing any of this stuff. And there's a lot of people in this world, millions of them in Canada and the US, that really, really need to hear this stuff. They need to hear people talk about this stuff. And that's why people like Jordan Peterson, look at him. The guy's a rock star and he's a freaking psychologist. Come on. I mean, who would have ever thought, right? But it's because people desperately need to hear these things.
Well, I can tell you this, like I absolutely agree with you, and as you know, by vocation, I'm a graphic artist, painter, illustrator. It's my stock and trade, and I'm somebody who picked up the battle call myself, and I see the world in disarray and everything falling around my ankles around me, and I figured, well, I just got to dust off this philosophical cap and get out there and exact my weight, such as it is, whatever that might be in a buck and change. But at least I'm making the effort to speak out on these issues. And but it's not something that I just picked up willy-nilly, just out of left field. Like I'm an artist one day, then all of a sudden I'm a philosopher. I'm not saying that. No, my study of philosophy goes way back to my teenagehood. So I used to hang out for a little bit there with Stefan Molyneux back in the day when we were in our 20s, I guess. And I don't know if you knew that, but there you go, a little bit of tidbit about me. Like we discussed these kind of subjects back and forth. We've had like many a conversation over donuts and coffee and pastry and sandwiches, like not just on one occasion, but back and forth. We traveled in the same circles. We were going to different lectures. We were both very interested in the philosophy of Ayn Rand. We considered ourselves objectivists at that time. And but pertaining to the whole question of God or collectivism, like one of the things that we discussed, and it pertains to what you were just mentioning right now, is that so far as human beings coming together, what's the best best way to live with one another. And you do have religious edicts, decreeing that because God ordains it or whatnot. So people created this. I think it's kind of like way before even recorded history. Very primitive human beings. They kind of gave a human face to nature. Whenever a volcano erupted, they attributed that to to the anger of some invisible deity that was pretty much like themselves, anthropomorphized nature. And so they kind of like, they lived an entirely external world. They weren't introspective, they weren't internal, not too much. They weren't, thinking in terms of, abstract thoughts of systems of philosophy, or how their mind works, psychology, and no, it was all external. They had to focus on the external world, or they would have perished. So it was all of this external concentration, and I think that kind of psychology created. People were looking at one another. They see animated objects moving about, and their fellow human beings, and they kind of incorporated a personality on nature per se, which later on became, God, with all the human attributes, anger and love and benevolence and so forth. And so in terms of like, people have like an internal sense of, here I am in this universe, I have to act, what should I do? How are we going to survive? So they still externalized that authority to a chiefman. Right, so it was a matter of externalizing, not internal. Like ethics could be internal, like trying to figure out what's the right thing for me to do, thinking philosophically. It's like, no, external. We will attribute it to what should be done to a divine commander, somebody who's been ordained by God, and even the concept of God himself. So that why should I do X became a matter of, well, because God, all powerful, almighty, says that you should, and he'll burn your ass if you don't. So this became, I think I said, like in another Prosscast, like the pillars of society that created this kind of like authoritarian collectivist ethics. The pillars in society would be the family, would be religion, would be the state. Why should I do X? Because God will burn your ass forever. Why should I do X? Because your parental authorities will punish you. Why should I do X when it comes to the state? Well, because you'll wind up in an orange jumpsuit. So it just all became, and once more of a secular forces came to bear, maybe with the Age of Enlightenment later on, after the Middle Ages and all of history, of course. People, when belief in God began to wane and come to the Age of Enlightenment, people still externalized, though. They didn't take the philosophy, introspective philosophy, whole hog. They still, okay, we needed an authority, so it's not God, that's just mystical mumbo jumbo, that's a bygone age. We're in a scientific age right now, the Age of Enlightenment. So now you have, scientific socialism, and now you have like it's not God that's to command you; it's a society or the government. The government is to direct society, and lodge God from his throne. So it was always this externalization of power. So that's the type of things that we would talk about. So does that make any sense to you?
Totally, Victor. Actually, like I say, that's the beautiful thing I love about talking to people like yourself and people that are intellectually and philosophically honest, is we're all trying to figure this stuff out. And like I say, I have total mad respect for people like Ayn Rand and Stefan Molyneux that are trying to, and like I say, hopefully we'll get to the point someday where we can make this so that it's as easy as 2 + 2 is 4, or gravity is real, right? And then everybody will understand that intrinsically, and that's how we'll cohabitate and coexist. I imagine that's probably not going to happen sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I didn't mean to interrupt your thought there.
Go ahead.
But what do you think is, to your mind, what is the clash between individualism and collectivism? What's taking place there that you side with one over the other?
Well, here's the thing, and this is very difficult. And like I say, which is why I say, even though I'm leaning towards it this particular time, like I say, it's never, I don't ground this in you have to believe what I'm saying. It's just humans have to have some compass, some moral or ethical compass that we all understand. There's no human being I don't think you'd ever find out there wouldn't accept that, yes, we have to have guiding principles as to how we cohabitate and coexist. Without them, we just go back to the state of nature, and then it's like whoever's the strongest survives, which, you know, no one's going to be able to function except for the strong. And then you end up with a lot of people that are harmed or killed off needlessly. So, but what it comes down to is, and Jordan Peterson's the one that, like I say, that's helped me understand this better than I could even tell myself, because, well, this is someone that's dealt with this for 3+ decades, is the thing that is contained. And like I say, hopefully we'll never have to do this, but the thing that contains mere mortals like kings or pharaohs or princes or princesses or whatever kind of label human beings have given themselves. The one thing that religion has always helped with every person, even the layman, is that it shows them, no, the ideal. So God, right? So whatever, God, just like gravity. We call it God, but let's just call it whatever you want to call it. The ideal is supreme, is superior to the person. So here's a perfect example. Ayn Rand, I think actually human beings, just by pure objectivism alone, I'm just picking a number out of my ass, but 98% of human activities and endeavors would function perfectly fine under objectivism philosophy, right? Because even with the whole pretense of selfish and doing things, even things that benefit yourself benefit humanity, right? Because you have to live inside this world where humanity exists. The problem is, then where do you attribute objectivism to? And she even recognized herself, and Molyneux, if you understand what he's been doing all these years, he's even moving away from promoting his own UPB. And I think both of them intrinsically, and I think, like I say, I'm just pulling shit out of my ass here, so I don't know, because I'm speaking as if, like, I don't know what Molyneux is saying or what Ayn Rand was saying, but what I'm thinking is you still have to attribute these ideas to, well, either Ayn Rand or Stefan Molyneux, which means you almost kind of got to, now that's like, I guess at the same time going back saying, well, you're attributing, some of the science-based understanding of the universe to, Newton or Galileo. But at that time, there was probably a lot of people that, the people that followed Galileo placed him as the new guide, right? So now we're smart enough, thousands of years later, we understand, well, it wasn't about Galileo per se saying that the earth is in the center of the universe and everything doesn't revolve around it, blah, blah, blah. But in that immediate aftermath, there might have been people that became very much cult followers. And if you turn to a cult or placing your faith in humanity or human beings, then that's open to subjugation once again, or subjective opinion. So people can, because of political speak, right? You know how that stuff works, even in religion. I mean, look at the denominations. Christianity has multiple. I mean, when I was growing up, there was Protestants, Presbyterians, Catholics, Baptists. I mean, the list, Presbyterian, what's the ones that speak in tongue? Anyways, but there was tons of them, and they all read from the same Bible, but they all interpreted different. So to me, I guess the whole premise, the whole pretense of God, which is something I'm learning now, which, like I say, I'm like you, I reject that pure dogmatism, because, well, if we're just going to read from scriptures, then, well, once again, we're no different than anyone that just reads from the Communist Manifesto. But ultimately, it has to be, take away all the other aspects and variances, it's just an ideal, and nobody has perfected that yet. Ayn Rand, Molyneux, and Jordan Peterson, maybe we'll figure out at some point in time how we can tie all this stuff into an actual true science where, like I say, it'll be not just taught for education purposes, but just every human being will understand that objective logic, reason, the NAP, not aggression principle, all that stuff is, and it requires a reciprocal effect, but all that has to do with acceptance of universally ethical and moral behaviors. If it comes from a person, well, then, like I say, then a king, a pharaoh, a dictator, a president, a prime minister can assume that role, that task, that responsibility. Whereas if it's kept a little bit outside of the realm of humans, right? If it's an ideal, well, we can't change that. Like a king, even people back in the day would say when the king would do something against what was in the Bible, well, people would say, hey, this king is not really moral because look, it's going against the ideal. So that's really what it comes down to me. And like I say, I will humbly accept the fact that I'm not an authority on it. I mean, I'm glad these people, everybody, people like yourself that is, I would admit you're an atheist, right? So I'm glad everybody's having their opinions, and hopefully someday we'll figure out some way to perfect this so that people understand intrinsically. But until that happens, we have to have open minds and be allowed people to have their opinions put forth and presented, which is something that, as you understand, the collectivists, they don't want nothing to do with it. They're scared to death of responsibility. They love the rights, well, especially positive rights, but they're scared to death of responsibility. And I think that's where the problem is, and where it resides, is they know the minute you if they air their laundry out there, well, then people will see it for what it is. It's based on not just mysticism. That's the thing. They talk about religious people as being mystics. Holy shit. If you ever listen to a leftist, I have a grandmother that's super religious, and I could probably convince her that God's not real quicker than I could convince some of these leftists that collectivism is not the proper way to deal with people on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. The whole thing of statism being like the result of mysticism. If you take mysticism and dwarfing and being in contrast to individualism, mysticism basically the whole idea that all of the universe comes from one source, and that being a supernatural source, God, and taking that kind of metaphysics, it has been, especially as illustrated and elaborated upon greatly by Plato, is that everything is one. You probably heard that. It sounds like some kind of like a college student 101 who's just wet behind the ears, and he's picking up on this philosophy, and it's just like, yeah, how do we know what exists and what doesn't exist? So yeah, we're all one. But actually, that does have a source in philosophical history. It's just that there is no identity. It's just all one. All of it comes God. You and I look like we're discrete entities, like separate, discrete entities. But according to this metaphysics, everything is just one. It's just all one source. There's no identity. There's no a this from a that. So with that kind of thinking, coming from God, and later on moved over to it became more secularized, this kind of like collectivized metaphysics. It carried over to that there are no individuals, right? We are just the collective it becomes like a living entity that dwarfs and surpasses individuals. In fact, according to the very extreme collectivist metaphysics, there is no individuals at all. For other collectivists, sure, there's individuals, but they're not important to society. But in extreme cases, of course, individuals do not exist. It's just the collective. It's like what, have you ever seen that illustration that's like based on, usually that's been on the Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, where you have all these people, like hundreds of people, and they're climbing up on top of one another, and it's like this very cool illustration. And then you can see with all the people collecting that they're forming one individual, where it looks the image optical illusion looks like one person, and it's the king, right? So it's a very cool illustration. Yeah. Maybe I'll send it off to my producer and show that. So this whole thing, for me, collectivism versus individualism it's completely anti-scientific in the sense of like science identifies the external world. We do recognize, even though we can speak of the physical sciences, where you have biology that studies inanimate or living organisms, you have physics that studies inanimate matter and so forth. And you wouldn't say that, well, these type of sciences are scientists are subjective. They're living, they have their own concoctions. No, they're studying one objective world. They're just focusing on different parts, though. And I think that that might very well be said with the volunteerist movement. I mean, there's a lot of division, there's a lot of clashes and things like that, but there is an underlining philosophy that unites all these people together. The principles might be misapplied or misunderstood, but there is, I think, a germ of an idea that unites all these people. And first of all, I think that that idea is to recognize that, yes, there is only individuals. There is no separate entity called society that's separate from the individuals that compose of it. And I think the people are defenders of liberty, and the libertarians or the anarchists or the voluntarists, I think that that's one of the fundamental things that they do, where they are on one page, right? So, and that has other implications too. If you're speaking of individual rights, not group rights, but individual rights, the reason why that doesn't pertain to animals is the reason why we don't. If an animal mauls another one, we don't have jurisprudence, we don't have systems of laws and courts when it comes to the animal kingdom, because they're living according to their nature, for Christ's sakes. Now, if we were to ask what is the nature of a human being, the nature of a human being is that we have a volitional consciousness. We don't have finely honed instincts like animals that help us survive. We don't live tooth and claw by killing and devouring one another, for Christ's sakes. Our whole mode of operating and survival is that of cooperation, of leaving each other the hell alone, so that we can pursue those activities that enable us to furnish the necessities of life. We can interact with one another. Division of labor in society adds to the quality of life, no doubt, but we can survive on a deserted island with a circle ball called Willie, or whatever that is, Castaway, things like that. Yeah. Right. So I would say that a lot of people, they attribute it to ethics as something that only pertains to human beings living with one another. You know, ethics only pertains to society. No, you need an ethical system. You on a deserted island, it doesn't just pertain to not molesting other people or violating their rights. Once again, this is where leaving the external aside, going internal, you realize that I just can't sit here inert and crawl up and start praying to God. Reality will wipe you out. You have to pay attention to reality. You have to learn to, if you're to build shelter for yourself, you have to learn the principles of gravity and construction, or whatever. I don't know the terminology or whatever, but there are principles involved that, if this structure I'm going to build is going to stand, you have to take all the scientific facts into hand, like the weight of the materials and all of that, of course, right? Or otherwise, if architects didn't study and didn't have a certain degree of objective facts, mathematics and engineering, the whole thing here is to prevent collapse. So you have to abide by a certain amount of facts, and the same could be said for ethics as well. There is a scientific basis. There is a rational, objective basis for ethics, and that is something that the individual has to discover for him or herself. And the recognition of individual rights just means that, I have to leave other people alone who are trying to do the same goddamn thing, right? Yeah. One of the charges of the objectivists, of the Ayn Rand, of the Randians, if you want to call it that, one of the objections that they have to anarchists is that they take the non-aggression principle, don't molest, don't violate other people, and they just take that as some kind of like holy edifice of what they denigrate as a floating abstraction. You see, as a floating abstraction, because we're failing to ask, okay, I understand that, don't molest and don't violate the rights of other people, but why? Why? The reason is because in order for us to act, we have to think scientifically. Everything that we do that advances our life, whether we become a stable, happy person, is an internal process. It's something that we have to fight within ourselves. It's we can get bombarded with lots of different messages. We can have the cognitive landscape just filled with all types of cults of personalities, all commercials, all types of information pounding and pouring onto us. But as we learned, from Rand, is that it's the individual. It's only it cannot think through a collective brain. It is the individual who has the sole responsibility to shake up his mental mental operations, and to dust off the cobwebs, and look at the world square and try to figure it out. And only the individual can exact and begin that engine of what's called thinking. So,
Yeah.
And coming into a rational ethics, she had a whole system of ethics explained, and she just didn't leave it at don't violate the rights of other people. She had a whole system of ethics that she purported, that which she considered to be like very rational and scientific. So, to the question of survival, it's not just a matter of leaving other people alone, because you also got to survive on a deserted island, and in fact, epistemologically and metaphysically, we are, each and every one of us is an island. We are already on an island, There's all these other people around us for sure, yeah, but you're the one who had, just like the guy on the island, he has to do something. And it's flourish or perish. Same goes in a society with millions of other people around you. So in that sense, ethics becomes a matter of survival, of reason, of the issue of reason of being applied to the challenge of survival. So I didn't mean to go off on an old rant myself there, but I just wanted to get
that was great, actually, because you know what? And when you were saying that, I was actually, I was just thinking about the fact when you talk about a person on an island, I was thinking this is so perfect, because when you talk about that, it's easy for people to make when you live in a society, but just like you said, if you lived in an island, right? If you use just pure like mathematics or efficiencies or, just that pure
apply the non-aggression principle on an island. Is that going to help you survive? Yeah, no. So,
well, no, but not only that, but let's say there's 200 trees on that island. You might be able to make an excuse or an example why you should burn all them logs up quickly and hopefully create a fire big enough that some plane flying overhead will see you. But there's also going to be a part of your brain thinking, but what if I'm not going to, if I have to survive more than a week on this island, I might want to allow some of those trees to exist, that I might have to come up with something maybe in the future, right? I might have to build a different shelter. Maybe a storm will destroy my existing future and it'll be washed back into the ocean and gone forever. Or, if you would be faced with
short-term, you'd be forced with short-term objectives that have to be met almost immediately, and you also have to forecast for long-term objectives. You don't want to burn all the trees down, right? But you need to burn some trees.
Exactly. But another thing I just want to say real quick too, because you touched on a little bit earlier on, is about the whole thing with because like I say, I come from a religious family, and I heard constantly growing up about this whole thing about, how did the universe come to exist? Well, God created the heavens, the earth, and and then on the seventh day he rested. You've heard the stories, right? And then as a student, but you know what? The funny thing is, but when you talk about like that mysticism, because that's what I grew up under, and I thought, once you put your objective brain to it, you're thinking, that seems really weird. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But then you listen to, like me as a young man, as a student, I would listen to what, the science of evolutionary basis and fundamentals taught was, oh, no, that's complete nonsense. That's crap. Don't listen to that. No, what it is there was nothing, and then there was a big bang, and then the earth come to exist, and it expanded out at certain speeds, and it's actually getting faster. It's like, wait a minute, that kind of sounds a little bit, actually a whole lot like the same kind of premise or concept. So what reality, what it should be when it comes to that stuff, and this is, I think, what ties in everything that we're really discussing when you're talking about morals and ethics, is because we don't, no one, not scientists, not evolutionary theorists, not, you know, dogmatic preachers or people from the religious aspect or theologists, none of them truly know how we come to exist. So
let me ask you this.
And both sides are kind of presenting this kind of scenario where it's, yeah, okay, there was nothing and then something come to exist. But in the modern era, it's not necessarily, hopefully we find out someday, but to me, all those things is just, okay, you're arguing about, and let's leave that open to interpretation, and let's hope that someday we figure that out. But what it comes down to is, yes, you're making a scientific premise and how we come to exist. Well, as human beings, like I said, we're not trying to live as animals or in a pure state of nature. If we were just trying to live in the pure state of nature, well, it'd be just like you see in the animal kingdom, where actually, I'll even bring this up because it kind of counters my own argument, but at the same time, I have to recognize the reality is, in the state of nature, most people would think, well, okay, well, then only the strong will survive. But in reality, even in the state of nature, there seems to be, which is where it gets down to that biological level, where I'm starting to hear where these people like even Brett Weinstein that's saying that, you know what, there might be something even intrinsic in our biology that tells us, no, just being a pure brute or authoritarian. Well, I don't know if you've heard about the studies or examples of like apes in the wild. You know, if you get some overbearing authoritarian gorilla or big ape or, well, okay, you might be able to use your power in the moment to dominate the rest of your tribe or whatever, and you might be able to do that. But then if you continue to do so, well, 2 or 3 of them might later on decide, well, you know what, this fucker's kind of being a little bit of a dick, right? So let's kick this guy to the curb and we'll pick one of us. So once again, it's pure authoritarianism, pure brute force. It doesn't function in what us humans, what we want to, like, we're trying to create basically a concept of like, well, in the biblical texture would be like a heaven on earth, or, you know, some of the communists or socialists is whatever, some kind of utopian, or even libertarians, if you think about it, or anarchists. We all have an ideal. We all have an ideal, no matter how you look at it, philosophically, politically, however you want to look at it, or in the state of nature, there is an ideal. And ultimately, the ideal has to come from somewhere. And my biggest thing, once again, it goes back to either we have to make it so scientific and like hopefully adopted by everyone. And I think that's probably going to be the best. I think God as a concept, as a pretense, will have to die eventually, right? It'll become, and just instead of calling it God, it'll be like some new form of science we want to call it, right? But ultimately, this is where my pragmatic side of me starts to think is, do we want to place our faith in human beings or in an ideal? And that ideal is outside of our realm. And you can't let collectivism, because that's the forced subjugation, that's the sacrificing of the individual for the greater good. And actually, that would have been some of the stuff that actually some of the Old Testament shit promoted, right? And there's some parts in the Bible, it's like, well, hey, that's kind of sounds a little bit socialist and communist too, right? If you read just by the scriptures and take them at face value. That's like, which is why you can't do that, which is why I think Jordan Peterson is so wise and so important to have him around this day and age. Is don't take these things as literal. Like, they're not meant to be taken as literal. Unfortunately, that's what dogmatists, that's what authoritarians do. They make it into a literal sense, and they use political language and doublespeak to make it seem like, well, that kind of makes sense. Ideally, though, it's just a matter of figuring out, tweaking, perfecting objectivism, UPB, and get to the point where we just all understand intrinsically that it's not just state of nature. It's the fact that we have to cohabitate and coexist as individuals, but on a planet with a whole lot of other individuals. So the live, let live, the NAP, I think, like I say, this is what drives me. Liberals, they had some great ideas in the past, genuine liberals, not the leftists. I mean genuine liberals, classical liberals. Conservatism. There's some, classical liberals. They had some great ideas in the past, right? And some of the, the pretense of some conservatism, where you have to maintain some of the things that we learned from the past, like you can't throw the baby with the bathwater. What I'm saying is, libertarians, anarchists such as yourself, why are we letting these idiots, these ideologues, whether it's from the left or these identitarians from the right, why the fuck are these people the one that get in the main stage? That's, I think, what drives me crazy the most is these are the people that's basically hammering out their ideas, which they're all just circle jerking as far as I'm concerned, because they all talk at the same side of the middle. Whereas people like yourself, people like myself, I mean, you know, there's a whole gamut of them nowadays. But on the political or media landscape, none of them are, well, I mean, Jordan Peterson, just by sheer fact of popularity and being in the right place at the right time, he is being taken more seriously and his approach is being adopted. But it's like we need more of these conversations like a Jordan Peterson and like a modern Ayn Rand, right? What's his name there? Shoot, I can't. You know his name, Victor, the guy, one of the better objectivists there. Shoot, what's his name?
He's an objectivist.
Yeah, he's always talking about Ayn Rand. He's got a bit of a lisp. I'd love to hear him talking with.
You're on Brooke.
That's it.
You're on.
Yeah. Like okay. We need these people. We need all these people to be in a room hammering these kinds of ideas and discussions out, because what we're seeing now, well, especially anyone that pays attention to just the establishment media landscape, is I see it's like you're just like back in the day where everyone's arguing from Catholicism or Catholicism and Presbyterians, whereas these people are saying, well, both of them have parts where they're wrong. Can you just listen to us? I'll tell you where there's Catholics that are wrong and there's Protestants that are wrong, but nobody's given us the main stage because, well, then you destroy all their constructive narratives, right?
Yeah, well, just one final question, because we've been going on here a little bit long here, and we have to have a tight show, of course. But a question though is like, what's your thoughts of cultural relativism?
Well, I understand
a
more or less.
Question to that would you? Sorry about that. Just before I just cut you off when I asked you a question, but and also at the same time, cultural relativism. And would you say that you, Bennett, that you subscribe that there is an objective, knowable external universe, and that not everything is just concocted from the heads of individuals, where the entire universe is not a fragment of clashing imaginations and constructs? Would you say that there is an objective reality external to human consciousness? Grasp that?
Yeah, I don't fall for that whole, especially that even that when you tie in that postmodernism, where there's this whole concept, which, as Jordan Peterson recognizes too, like you can make some arguments, you know, and point to there are different variants and variables as far as, you know, particular subjugation in particular topics or premises or principles. But no, there is like an objective morality and reality to how we cohabitate and coexist, because we all understand it when we deal with each other on a daily basis. You know, we don't have to have science. Even a little child, you don't even have to understand science to know that if you do an experiment day in and day out, 9 times out of 10, or a lot of times even 10 times out of 10, if you do certain particular things, then you know what the consequence is going to be, right? And that, well, I guess in some way, this is the problem. See, that's the thing we're deterring punishment. Well, there's where even what?
Are you talking about consequences going to happen? Are you talking about punishments from adults, or meaning that are you talking about like learning things like if you touch a fire that it's going to burn? Are you talking about like learning principles like that?
Well, not just fire if you burn, because that's an easy one, but even you can expand that out even when you deal with other people, right? I mean, we all live our life, as much as people try to talk about, you know, government and all that stuff. If you went around using the government principle, or that everything's just, you know, the end game is just whoever has the most power or ability to dominate the other, then, and without having free will, then you end up in the same situation where, like I say, then you just go back into that pure state of nature where, okay, then moral relativists might as well just accept the fact, because usually they're the people that, in the grand scheme of things, would be the the chimp at the lower end of the hierarchy. But even the chimp at the lower end of the hierarchy. What? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead with your point there on the chat. I don't want to
Well, no,
interrupt. Go
actually,
ahead.
I'm not even 100% sure. So are you talking about free will versus determinism? Because I'm actually not 100% sure where exactly you're going here with this.
Well, no. I was I'm suggesting that, like, insofar as is like there's any division and clashes and subjectivism in the freedom movement, I think that this is what you're touching on, right? Like you're looking for like you're looking for an Einstein kind of like central theory that or nebulous that will draw all voluntarists together and to have like a more of a solid understanding and grounding where there isn't so much division.
Well, let me make it real simple, just like I was trying to say earlier. So how to simplify things best basically is what I'm thinking about. So let's say you had 10 board games set up, right, in this big gigantic room, and it was it was the same board game, but there were 10 different ways that they set up the rules for the game. You would find out just by, and that would be just market forces, the invisible hand, whatever you want to call it, right? You would find out real quickly that eventually over time you would see everybody would be gravitating, and not by force, not by compulsion, not through mysticism, not by any other means other than the fact that people would recognize this is what makes sense. Because whether I'm on the lower end of the hierarchy, in the middle, or at the top, if we play this game, as long as the rules are universally consistent, ethical, moral, right, and everyone has to abide by them consistently, then the person that's most competent or has the most skills and is moral by doing so, because it's not just about skills too, because you also have to be moral, right? So no one's going to want to play a game with someone that's playing the game immorally, even though the rules are set out properly. If someone don't obey or abide by those rules, then you're not going to want to be able to play with those people. Just like humans, we're just, like I say, it's just like people playing a big giant game, really is way you can make it as most simplistic as possible. And really what it comes down to is, sure, if collectivists, socialists, communists, fascists, whatever the hell, feminist, whatever, go ahead, try to play your game. But ultimately at the end of the consequence of that is you're going to realize that if you allow market competition or the free ideas to flourish and exist, everybody will gravitate towards libertarianism, anarchism, voluntarism, just by sheer fact that whether they win, lose, or somewhere in between, everyone understands intrinsically we're all given the same opportunity to play the game. Doesn't mean you're going to get the same result. You know, that's what Marxists, that's what these envious types, right? Usually people that don't finish very well in competitive models is they're like, well, I hate the fact that I always do bad. But you know what? The only way, just like with my kids, if they didn't do good, well, it wasn't that I didn't coddle them. It's like, well, you better learn to do better, right? And that's ultimately, that's all the rules or the ideal represent is these are the rules. Learn to play the game and accept the fact that if you don't learn, if you've given the chance to play the game 1,000 times and you never get to the point where you ever get to be somewhere in the middle of the pack or at the top, well, that's just happens to be your place. And just be happy with that because you're allowed to play the game. Everyone's saying, come on in, play the game. You're accepting, right? That's the thing that people don't understand too about like individuals. They say, oh, they're all selfish. It's all about being selfish. No, because libertarians, anarchists, volunteers, everyone's allowed to play the game. Play the game. Enjoy the game. The difference is you don't get to impose your preferences, your ideas, or change the rules halfway through the game. We're all playing the same game. Where you're going to end up on that game, well, that's the thing. You might not necessarily beat your opponent, but there might be something else in your life that maybe winning that game isn't the most important thing to you, right? That's I think the ultimate thing when it comes down to is just having the same rules for everybody.
Well, yeah, for sure. You know, and I think that just to close up here, I think that if freedom and liberty has been exacted to some measure in human history, and we see the results of an explosion of wealth and unhappiness, and mortality rates drop whenever the principles of freedom have been put forth. Whenever there's been mass movements and philosophical revolutions, that resulted in the American Revolution or the French Revolution or the Communist Revolution, whatever type of ideas that are gaining prominence, will lay to bear the results of what kind of society that comes from those major philosophical premises will be drawn out logically, will result from the premises. And I think that if freedom and liberty is to have any chance whatsoever, I think that we do have to return to objectivism, using not the capital O in this case, but the lowercase o. In fact, it ran creating an entire system of philosophy that catered and spoke to liberty and freedom. She errs when it comes to government, but that's another discussion. And I think I said this in a Prosscast recently, where Ayn Rand was asked one time by reporters and booksellers on the eve of her publication of Atlas Shrugged. She was asked, "Ms. Rand, can you encapsulate your philosophy while standing on one foot?" And she did. She stood on one foot. She went through all the major branches, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics. And metaphysics, she said, objective reality. Epistemology, reason. Ethics, rational self-interest. Politics, capitalism. So there you have system building one on the other, where they're all linked together. You start with the world in philosophy. When it comes to liberty and speaking of liberty and looking for a free society, you can't bypass the base upon which all that depends. So you have an objective reality. We do live in a world where we have to use our minds. That bridges us immediately to epistemology. Here I am. I'm living in this world. It's absolute. It's external. My wishes and feelings and whims is not going to alter this metaphysical given. I have to use my mind to figure out what's going on. So you have a rational epistemology that goes hand in hand. It's almost indivisible. The line between metaphysics and epistemology, it's almost indivisible. And that leaves you to another question. Once I figure it out, once I'm using my head to figure out how all types of things are working, what am I to do? What kind of actions do I have to take? That takes us to ethics. And you have to act, and your ethics has to be in accord with reason, has to be in accord with the discovery of the objective universe. How do things work? Again, you're on that deserted island. It's real. You're there. You have to deal with it. You can't eat sand and call it food because your feels dictated that you do so. So and then when it comes to politics or economics in this case, then you have the division of labor. That's where that's where we're not on an deserted island. We are interacting with other human beings. So that's where the issue of politics comes at hand. And economics, of course, boils down to how we to interact with one another. Well, how we're to interact with one another is through voluntary means, without using force. Why? Because we recognize that other human beings have to use, going back again to the philosophical base, have to use their reason to figure out how to live in this objective world. And that's the only reason why you have individual rights and the non-aggression principle. But you just can't leave it at that. You just can't hold them up as holy edifices and then praise them and speak them over and over and over again like they're disconnected from everything else, like it's disconnected from everything else. That's the mistake. And that's why objectivists, they have this charge of what they call the non-aggression principle as being a floating abstraction. It has to be connected right down to the metaphysical base upon which it depends. And there you go. That's my closing spiel. I better wrap up here now. I've got another pressing appointment that's going to be coming around, which will be a debate with Jan Helfeld. So nice. I do appreciate you talking with me today. And we will
expect lots of questions from Jan, huh? You know his game.
Yeah, I know. Here with the tanks on the lawn and the phone call to the house. Give me your net worth, or I'll blow your house up to smithereens. I'll huff and puff and blow your house down. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but I'll deal with that when it
But
comes.
you know what? It's funny actually, and like I say, I'll tie it real quick here. But yeah, it's funny when you tie the economics into it because it's something I understood too. And what I took mostly out of economics, and if you understand it from the principled aspect, not just pure, abstract, but it's placing value, right? So it's still, once again, it's an ideal, it's a value, and a value, whether you look at it, philosophically, as far as logic or morality or ethics. Yes, people have to have a value, which is another one of those things. What collectivists and socialists and communists is they remove value, and when you remove that value, that measure of value, you're basically just turning human beings into just, well, slaves once again, once you take away value from the equation. And that's something that I love about like people like Ayn Rand, once again, that tied the economics into her philosophy. It's beautiful. Like I say, and I tie this up real quick. Hopefully it will get to the point someday. My biggest concern, which I think a lot of people's concern right now because of the current state of the world that we do live in, is we don't necessarily want to say place all your faith in a God, like a mystical being, but at the very least, in the absence of knowing or having proof that an ideal doesn't matter, don't ever place your faith in like a government, any central planned entity that at least with a pretense of an ideal, right? So objectivism is an ideal concept, or NAP or the UPB. It's all about the pretense of a universally consistent methodology of getting from point A to B. Whereas government, well, you're just placing all that stuff in the hands of fallible human beings instead of a concept. And the concept of government, we already understand, like the terminology is already there. The rules are already laid out for that game. And you're placing your hands or your faith in the hands of not just fallible human beings, but human beings that, as the very basis of how they want to do things, is through the means of force and coercion. The minute you enter that into the equation, then, well, like I said, it's just that race to who just wants to take over that big gigantic gun in the room. So ultimately, nobody, I'm sure I know, I think we all understand, government's not going anywhere tomorrow. But if I'm speaking to a human being, another person, I'm not playing the minarchism game. I'm not playing you got to believe, just put your whole faith into this concept that's called God. And hey, don't worry, I'll explain that to you. I want to explain to human beings, like I'm doing today, here's all these different things that humans have learned over the culmination of our existence. And the most important thing you can do is do what you believe is going to be right, not just for you, and not just for you today, but for you tomorrow, but for you next year. And you have to live in the world too. So it can't be just about you, although you have to take priority, the individual, right? We have to, if we don't take priority in ourselves, well, that just makes us subjects or lambs to sacrifice for someone else. So you have to be first and foremost. The ideal is the individual. And the individual has to live inside a group. And like you say, unless you're living on that island, but even on that island, you're still going to have to adopt the same kind of universally consistent moral ethics that are going to benefit you today, tomorrow, next month, next year, and until you take your last breath. So yeah, I'm grateful that we had this conversation, Victor. Like I say, it's just, for me, I'm sure people have heard this kind of stuff from many other people in many different ways, but maybe we say it in a different manner that maybe other people will understand or interpret. That's not, I know from my end of it anyways, because I don't get all don't use a whole lot of big words. I try to talk, well, that's why I try to learn things to the point where I can speak just like as though I was talking to my buddy, right? So that people just understand what we're trying to say instead of trying to trick them with fucking linguistics or, these weird fucking, where people just have to look up constantly in the dictionary. What the hell did this guy even mean? Just speak truth and reason and logic and common sense to people. And you're 9/10 of the way there, right?
Yeah, no, somebody once said to me, Victor, why are you so verbose? And some other guy said, what the hell's verbose? But anyway, got to cut it out here. And thanks a lot, Bennett. And we'll talk online. We'll take care, and we can talk again down the line in the future.
It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.